A man who spends his days sweeping floors and scrubbing marble is humiliated in front of everyone, mocked for the life he doesn't have. But behind his quiet eyes lies a truth no one could imagine, because the building he's cleaning, he designed it, he built it. And when the world begins to discover what was stolen from him decades ago, everything spirals out of control. The CEO who mocked him is hiding lies. The city is torn between doubt and belief, and the janitor who's been invisible for years suddenly has the chance to claim his legacy or lose it forever. How far will one man go to prove the truth? And when the fight for dignity collides with greed, who will the world believe? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The darkness outside Harold Jamison's bedroom window was just starting to soften into a pale gray when his alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m. He didn't need it anymore. His body knew the rhythm of these early mornings after so many years, but he kept setting it anyway, a habit as familiar as the creak in his knees as he rose from bed. His small apartment was neat and tidy, everything in its place. Family photos lined the walls. His late wife Margaret's gentle smile, his 3 children in graduation gowns, and 5 grandchildren with gap-toothed grins. A worn Bible sat on his bedside table, its pages dog-eared and filled with underlined verses. Harold shuffled to his tiny kitchen, his movements slow but purposeful. The coffee maker sputtered to life, filling the quiet apartment with its warm aroma. While it brewed, he carefully pressed his navy blue uniform, making sure every crease was sharp. Margaret had always said, "A man's pride shows in how he presents himself." Even if he was just a janitor now, he would look proper. The coffee was black and strong, just the way he liked it. Harold poured it into his thermos, the same one he'd carried for the past 15 years. Through the window, he watched the city slowly wake up. Chicago had changed so much since he'd first arrived here as a young man with dreams of building beautiful things. At the bus stop, the morning air was crisp. Harold pulled his worn jacket closer, nodding to the familiar faces he saw every morning. The young nurse heading home from night shift, the baker with flour still on his sleeves, the high school kid who always had his nose in a book. They were like family now, this early morning crew. The bus creaked to a stop, and Harold carefully climbed aboard, dropping his coins into the fare box. He settled into his usual seat, watching the city roll by through windows spotted with morning dew. The sky was lightening now, turning the glass and steel towers ahead into silhouettes against the dawn. As the bus approached downtown, Harold began humming softly, "Amazing Grace," his mother's favorite hymn. The melody always brought him peace, even on the hardest days. Other passengers smiled at the familiar sound. Some even hummed along quietly. The massive skyscraper where he worked rose before him, its gleaming facade reaching toward heaven. Harold remembered watching it go up, remembered the pride he'd felt designing those sweeping lines and elegant angles. But that was another life, before everything had been taken away. "Morning, Mr. Jamison," called Jerry, the security guard, as Harold pushed through the heavy glass doors into the lobby. "Morning, Jerry. How's that grandbaby of yours doing?" "Growing like a weed, Mr. Jamison. Walking now, if you can believe it." Harold smiled, genuinely happy for the younger man. Jerry was one of the good ones. He treated everyone with respect, no matter their job title. The lobby was quiet at this hour, Harold's footsteps echoing off the marble floors he'd polished countless times. He made his way to the janitor's closet, gathering his supplies with practiced efficiency. The mop bucket's wheels squeaked slightly as he rolled it out. He'd been meaning to oil them, but hadn't gotten around to it yet. As he worked, Harold hummed his way through old gospel songs, the music keeping time with the steady back-and-forth motion of his mop. "Precious Lord, take my hand," filled the empty space as he watched the floor shine beneath his careful attention. The early morning light began streaming through the towering windows, creating patterns on the marble floor. Harold remembered suggesting those windows during the design phase, arguing for their placement to capture the morning sun just so. Of course, his name wasn't on any of those plans anymore. More people began filtering in as the clock approached 7:00 a.m. Some nodded hello, others walked past as if he were invisible. Harold didn't mind much. He'd learned long ago that a person's character showed in how they treated those they thought couldn't help them. He was finishing up the last section of the lobby when he heard them coming, the loud, braying laughter that always announced Brad Keller and his entourage. Harold kept his head down, focusing on his work, hoping to avoid notice. But fate had other plans. As Harold moved his mop bucket, one of its wheels caught on an uneven spot in the floor. He stumbled slightly, accidentally bumping into the group as they passed. "Watch where you're going," Keller snapped, his expensive suit barely brushed but his pride clearly wounded. The young CEO's eyes narrowed as he looked Harold up and down, taking in the worn uniform, the patched jacket, the scuffed shoes that Harold kept clean but couldn't afford to replace. A cruel smile spread across Keller's face as he turned to his associates. "Look at this, gentlemen. 30 years of pushing a mop, and he still can't afford decent shoes." The others chuckled obediently as Keller leaned in closer to Harold, his voice dripping with contempt. "You'll never own anything nice in your life." Harold stood perfectly still, his hands tight on the mop handle, his face carefully blank, despite the shame and anger burning in his chest. He'd faced worse in his life, much worse, but somehow this casual cruelty still had the power to sting. The group moved on, their laughter echoing off the marble walls Harold had just cleaned. He watched them disappear into an elevator, then quietly returned to his work, his hymns momentarily forgotten in the heavy silence of the morning. Harold's hands trembled as he fumbled with the supply closet door, desperate to escape the echo of Brad Keller's cruel words. The small room smelled of bleach and pine-scented cleaners, a familiar refuge where he'd spent countless hours organizing supplies and gathering his thoughts. Now, it felt like the walls were closing in as memories he'd tried so hard to suppress came flooding back. He slumped onto an overturned bucket, his worn shoes, the very ones Keller had mocked, scuffing against the concrete floor. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance with the ghosts of his past. "These are remarkable designs, Jameson," Mr. Davidson, the project manager, had said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. But there had been something in his eyes, a coldness that Harold should have recognized sooner. A week later, Harold had arrived at the office to find his desk cleared out. His drawings were gone. When he demanded answers, security had escorted him out, Davidson's words ringing in his ears. "Know your place, boy. Nobody's going to believe a colored janitor designed this building." The memory made Harold's chest tighten. He'd tried to fight back, had gone to lawyers who wouldn't even look at his case, to newspapers that wouldn't print his story. He'd watched helplessly as Davidson and his partners broke ground on the project, using Harold's designs but erasing his name completely. "You should be grateful we even let you clean these floors," Davidson had sneered when Harold confronted him one last time. The words had cut deep, but not as deep as the laughter that followed, the same kind of entitled laughter he'd heard from Brad Keller this morning. Harold's fingers traced the smooth wood of his mop handle, the grain familiar after years of use. The job hadn't been his dream, but it had put food on the table when no architectural firm would hire him. He'd swallowed his pride, accepted the work with dignity, and thanked God for providing a way to support his family. But some nights, when the building was empty except for him and his memories, he'd stop mopping to study the graceful lines of the lobby, the perfect balance of light and shadow he'd envisioned so long ago. His creation, standing proud and tall, while he remained invisible in its shadows. "You'll never own anything nice," Keller had said, but the truth was, Harold owned something far more valuable than expensive shoes or fancy suits. He owned the vision that had raised this building to the sky, even if no one else knew it. The thought brought both comfort and fresh pain. The supply closet's shelves stood in neat rows around him, each bottle and brush in its proper place. A small domain where he could maintain order in a world that had denied him justice. Harold remembered how his grandmother used to say, "Baby, they can strip away your chances, but they can't strip away your dignity unless you let them." He'd held on to those words through the years, through every slight and dismissal, through watching younger men with half his talent climb the corporate ladder while he remained at its bottom rung. He'd held on to them while pushing his children to pursue their dreams, never letting his own disappointments dim their ambitions. His hands were shaking again, but this time with something more than hurt. a slow-burning anger that had simmered for decades. Keller's casual cruelty was just another verse in an old, painful song. The same tune that had played when Davidson stole his designs, when the lawyers turned him away, when he'd had to explain to his children why their daddy was mopping floors instead of building towers. The memory of his children's faces, confused, worried, but still looking up to him with love and respect, brought tears to his eyes. He'd taught them to hold their heads high, to believe in themselves even when others didn't. What would they think if they could see him now, hiding in a supply closet, letting another man's words cut him down? Harold stood up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. The mop handle felt solid in his grip, a familiar anchor in the storm of emotions. Above the supply closet's door, a small cross hung on a nail, something he'd placed there years ago, as a reminder of where his true strength came from. The words rose from deep within him, a whisper that carried the weight of decades. "Lord, give me strength." It was the same prayer he'd offered countless times before. When Davidson had stolen his dreams, when doors had closed in his face, when his wife had passed and left him to raise their children alone. The same prayer that had carried him through every dark night and every bitter dawn. In the harsh fluorescent light of the supply closet, surrounded by the tools of his trade, Harold Jamison stood straight and tall. His shoes might be worn, but his spirit, the spirit that had designed this very building, remained unbroken. The prayer lingered on his lips, a shield against the wounds that never seemed to fully heal. "Lord, give me strength." The basement of the Chicago Commerce Building was always quieter in the evening hours. Harold preferred it that way. Down here, among the humming machinery and dim fluorescent lights, he could work in peace without worrying about running into people like Brad Keller. His weathered hands moved methodically across the brass fixtures, working polish into the metal with small circular motions. The familiar motion was soothing, helping to calm the storm of emotions still churning inside him from that morning's encounter. As he worked, he hummed Amazing Grace under his breath, letting the old hymn's melody wash over him like a healing balm. The basement walls were lined with copper pipes and electrical conduits, all meticulously maintained over the decades. Harold knew every inch of this place, every corner and crevice. He'd cleaned them all countless times. But tonight, something caught his eye. A section of wall paneling that seemed slightly askew. Harold paused, in his polishing, cloth still in hand. In all his years working here, he'd never noticed that panel being crooked before. Setting aside his cleaning supplies, he approached the wall for a closer look. The metal panel was about waist height, its edges dulled with age. When he ran his fingers along the seam, he felt it give slightly. "Well, what do we have here?" he muttered to himself, pressing gently. The panel shifted, revealing it wasn't properly secured. Maintenance should know about this, he thought. But curiosity got the better of him, and he carefully worked his fingers behind the edge. With a soft metallic groan, the panel came loose in his hands. Harold set it carefully aside, not wanting to make any noise that might draw attention. Behind the panel was a shallow recess in the concrete wall, filled with decades of dust and cobwebs. But there was something else there, too. Something flat and metallic gleaming dully in the fluorescent light. Harold's heart began to beat faster as he reached into the recess. His fingers closed around what felt like a plaque. As he carefully withdrew it from its hiding place, a cloud of dust made him cough and blink rapidly. He pulled out his handkerchief and began wiping away years of grime from the surface. The first thing that emerged was the logo of Marshall Construction Company, the original developers of the building. Harold's hands began to shake as more words became visible beneath his cleaning. Chicago Commerce Building, designed and built under the direction of Harold Jamison, Chief Architect and Builder, 1975. The polishing cloth slipped from Harold's suddenly nerveless fingers. He staggered back until his shoulders hit the opposite wall, the plaque heavy in his trembling hands. His own name stared back at him, etched permanently in bronze. Proof of what had been stolen from him all those years ago. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. His vision blurred as tears welled up in his eyes. He remembered the day they'd commissioned this plaque, remembered standing proud as they'd taken measurements for it, back when he'd believed in promises and handshakes. But the plaque had never been mounted. Instead, another one had gone up in the lobby, bearing different names. White names. Respectable names. His contribution had been buried down here in the darkness, hidden away like something shameful. Harold sank down onto a nearby maintenance stool, his legs too weak to hold him. The weight of decades of injustice pressed down on his shoulders as he traced his fingers over the engraved letters of his name. Every curve and line was a testament to what had been taken from him. Not just credit for his work, but his dignity, his career, his dreams. The basement silence seemed to deepen around him as memories flooded back. The long nights spent hunched over drafting tables, the careful calculations, the pride he'd taken in every detail of the building's design. He remembered supervising the construction crews, watching his vision rise floor by floor into the Chicago sky. This building wasn't just steel and concrete, it was his life's work, his masterpiece. He thought of all the years he'd spent cleaning these halls, watching others take credit for his creation. How many times had he buffed the floors he'd originally specified? How often had he changed light bulbs and fixtures he'd selected? Every day, he'd maintained the very building he'd brought into being, while those who'd wronged him grew rich from his work. Through tears, Harold studied the plaque more closely. The bronze surface was still beautiful despite its years in darkness, the engraving deep and precise. This was real. This was evidence. All these years, proof of his contribution had been here, hidden away behind a wall panel, waiting to be found. His hands continued to shake as he wiped away the last traces of dust from his name. The letters caught the light, seeming to glow with an inner fire. Harold's throat tightened as he read the inscription again and again, each time feeling the weight of its significance more deeply. "They thought they erased me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the building's mechanical hum. Each word came out heavy with decades of suppressed pain and anger. This plaque was more than just metal and engraving. It was vindication, a voice from the past crying out for justice. The building seemed to hold its breath around him as he sat there in the basement's fluorescent gloom, cradling the physical proof of his stolen legacy in his weathered hands. The quiet was broken only by the distant thrum of machinery and the sound of his own unsteady breathing as he stared at his name, finally brought back into the light after all these years. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Chicago Commerce Building, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Harold balanced carefully on his stepladder, his aged hands steady as he worked to replace a flickering fluorescent bulb in the third-floor hallway. His movements were deliberate but weary, weighted down by yesterday's memories. Maria Delgado hurried down the hallway, her heels clicking against the marble floor, when she noticed the elderly janitor's slumped shoulders. She'd seen him nearly every morning during her 3-month internship, always humming and wearing a gentle smile. Today was different. Something about his silence made her pause. "Good morning, Mr. Jameson," she said, adjusting the stack of files in her arms. "Are you okay? You seem a little down today." Harold glanced down, surprised by the genuine concern in her voice. Most people walked past him like he was invisible. "I'm fine, miss. Just another day's work." His voice was soft, tired. "I'm Maria," she offered, shifting the files to extend her hand. "I've seen you around, always making this place shine. You do amazing work." Harold carefully descended the ladder, taking her small hand in his calloused one. "Thank you, Maria. That's kind of you to say." He managed a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Something's bothering you," Maria said. It wasn't a question. Growing up with her abuela had taught her to read people's hearts in their eyes. "Would you like to talk about it?" Harold hesitated, studying the young woman's earnest face. There was something familiar in her expression, the same determination he'd seen in his own daughter's eyes years ago. After a moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the tarnished brass plaque. "Found this yesterday," he said quietly, holding it out to her. "Hidden away in the basement wall for 40 years. Maria took the plaque, her dark eyes widening as she read the inscription. "In recognition of Harold Jameson, Chief Architect and Builder of the Chicago Commerce Building, 1975. Wait, she looked up at him in shock. "You built this building?" Harold nodded slowly, drew up the plans, supervised the construction, every detail, but when it was finished, he trailed off, the old pain evident in his voice. "They took the credit from you," Maria finished softly, anger flashing in her eyes. "Because you're black." "Different times back then," Harold said, though they both knew similar injustices still happened. The development company had their own plans. Couldn't have a colored man getting recognition for building something this grand. He tried to keep the bitterness from his voice, but it slipped through anyway. Maria's fingers tightened around the plaque. "This isn't right, Mr. Jameson. You should be honored, not." She gestured at his janitorial cart. "Not hidden away like this plaque was." "What's done is done," Harold said, reaching for the plaque. But Maria held on to it. "No," she said firmly. "It's not done. We can fix this. We can tell your story." Harold shook his head. "Young lady, I appreciate the thought, but—" "Please," Maria interrupted. "Let me help. I'm good with computers, social media. People need to know the truth." Her voice softened. "Your grandchildren should know their grandfather built this beautiful building." Before Harold could respond, voices echoed from around the corner. Brad Keller appeared with his usual entourage, heading toward the conference room. Maria quickly slipped the plaque into her bag and pretended to check her phone. "Still haven't replaced those shoes, I see?" Keller sneered as he passed Harold. "Though I suppose they match the rest of your," he gestured dismissively, "ensemble." Harold's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Maria, however, had already pulled out her phone and was secretly recording. "You know what I love about having janitors like him?" Keller continued to his laughing associates as they entered the conference room. "Reminds everyone what happens when you don't work hard enough to succeed. Some people are just meant to clean up after their betters." The door closed behind them, but not before Maria captured every word. Her hands shook with anger as she stopped the recording and quickly sent it to her private email. She turned to Harold, who stood very still, his dignity intact despite the cruel words. "Mr. Jameson," she said quietly, "I promise you, this time they won't get away with burying the truth." Harold looked at the young woman, seeing a fire in her that reminded him of the civil rights activists he'd known in his youth. He thought of the plaque, hidden away for decades like his dreams, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. "Call me Harold," he said finally. "And, Maria, thank you for seeing me." She smiled, touching his arm gently. "They tried to make you invisible, Harold, but I see you, and soon, everyone else will too." Maria sat cross-legged on her small bed in her family's apartment, her laptop balanced on her knees. The clock on her nightstand showed 8:45 p.m. She had watched the video of Brad Keller mocking Harold at least 10 times now, each viewing making her stomach twist with anger. "Time to do something about this," she muttered, opening her social media account. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered her words carefully. Finally she typed, "The janitor who built this building. Simple, direct, true." She added a brief description below the video. "Meet Harold Jameson. He designed and built the Chicago Commerce Building in the 1970s. Today, he cleans it as a janitor, while others take credit for his work. This is how the CEO treats him." Maria's hand trembled slightly as she clicked "Post." She took a deep breath, said a quick prayer like her abuela had taught her, and closed her laptop. Whatever happened next was out of her hands. By midnight, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The notifications kept coming. "This is disgusting. That poor man. Who does this CEO think he is? Someone needs to investigate this. My grandfather worked construction in Chicago back then. He might remember this." Maria watched in amazement as the view count climbed. 100, 1,000, 10,000. People were sharing it, tagging news outlets, demanding answers. She saw Harold's name trending in Chicago by the time she finally fell asleep. Across town, in his modest apartment, Harold slept peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing online. His old flip phone sat quiet on his nightstand, charging beside his worn Bible. The first rays of dawn were just breaking through his window when the phone started vibrating. Harold reached for it with weathered hands, squinting at the small screen. His grandson Marcus's name flashed repeatedly. "Marcus? What's wrong, son? It's awful early." Harold's voice was thick with sleep. "Grandpa, have you seen it? The video's everywhere." Marcus's voice crackled with excitement. "What video? You're all over social media. Someone posted about you in the building. People are sharing your story." Before Harold could respond, another call beeped through. Then another. His granddaughter Tanya. His nephew James. Even his pastor. Harold sat up slowly in bed, his heart beating faster as he listened to Marcus explain about the viral video. He remembered Maria holding up her phone during yesterday's meeting, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, his free hand gripping his blanket. His phone dinged with incoming text messages. Links to the video, screenshots of comments, words of support from family members he hadn't heard from in years. "Grandpa, they're saying you should get credit for the building," Marcus continued. "People want to know the whole story." Harold's eyes drifted to the old framed photo on his dresser, himself as a young man, standing proud in a hard hat, blueprints rolled under his arm. He'd kept that picture hidden away for so long, like so many other pieces of his past. "I don't know about all this, Marcus," he said slowly. "Sometimes leaving sleeping dogs lie is the wise thing to do." But his grandson wouldn't hear it. "No, Grandpa, it's time people knew the truth. You deserve this." Harold's phone buzzed again, a text from Maria. "Mr. Jameson, I hope you're not mad. People needed to know. Check your email, reporters want to talk to you." He felt a warmth in his chest, thinking about this young woman fighting for him when he'd stopped fighting for himself long ago. It reminded him of his late wife Gloria, who'd always urged him to stand up for what was right. Moving to his small kitchen, Harold went through his morning routine with trembling hands. He boiled water for instant coffee, though his appetite for breakfast had vanished. His phone continued its constant chorus of notifications. As he sat at his scratched kitchen table, steam rising from his coffee mug, Harold allowed himself a small smile. For decades, he'd walked the halls of that building in silence, watching others take credit for his work. He'd swallowed his pride, accepted their dismissal, buried his pain in prayer and quiet service. But now, the smile faded as quickly as it had come. He thought of Brad Keller's sneering face, the way the man's expensive shoes clicked against the marble floors Harold polished every morning. Keller wasn't the type to accept humiliation quietly. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Maria. "Don't worry, Mr. Jameson, we've got proof. We've got the plaque. Truth is truth." Harold picked up his Bible, worn and creased from years of daily reading. He opened it to Psalms, his favorite book for troubled times. As he read, his coffee grew cold, untouched. The words brought comfort, but couldn't completely quiet the knot of anxiety in his stomach. He'd seen what powerful men could do when threatened. He'd learned that lesson the hard way back in '76, when they'd first stolen his dream. Still, as he got dressed for work in his clean but threadbare uniform, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Small and fragile, like a spark in the wind, but hope nonetheless. "Lord," he prayed quietly as he knotted his tie, "whatever comes of this, let it be your will, not mine." He tucked the phone in his pocket, feeling it vibrate with yet another message. The truth was out now, for better or worse. Harold smiled cautiously, but his hands shook slightly as he locked his apartment door. Standing at his bus stop in the early morning light, Harold watched the city wake up around him. The same streets, the same buildings, the same routine he'd followed for decades. But something had shifted, like the ground beneath his feet had quietly changed overnight. He looked up at the sky, pink and gold with dawn, and remembered his mother's favorite saying, "The truth always rises, like the morning sun." He just prayed he was strong enough to face whatever the day might bring. The morning light filtered through the towering glass windows of Keller Development's executive floor, casting long shadows across the pristine hallway. Harold's footsteps echoed against the marble as Jenny, Brad Keller's assistant, led him toward the CEO's office. His weathered hands clutched the dedication plaque, its brass surface warming against his palms. "Mr. Keller will see you now," Jenny said, her voice tinged with sympathy. Harold nodded, straightened his gray uniform, and entered the spacious corner office. Brad Keller stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the door, hands clasped behind his expensive suit. "Sit down, Jameson." Keller's voice was ice cold. Harold lowered himself into one of the leather chairs facing the massive mahogany desk. The plaque rested in his lap, a weight both comforting and heavy. Keller turned, his face flushed with anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" He slapped a tablet onto his desk, where the viral video played silently. "This little stunt has cost us contracts. People are calling us racist. My own board is asking questions." "I didn't post that video, sir," Harold said quietly. "But you're behind it, aren't you?" Keller leaned forward, his hands pressing against the desk. "This ridiculous story about you designing this building? What are you trying to pull?" Harold's fingers traced the engraved letters of his name on the plaque. "It's not a story, Mr. Keller. It's the truth." He placed the plaque on the desk. "I found this in the basement." Keller barely glanced at it. "A fake. Obviously." He straightened up, adjusting his tie. "Listen, Jameson. You've been here a long time. You're reliable, good at what you do. But if you persist with these lies, I'll have no choice but to terminate your employment." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Harold felt his heart beating harder, but kept his voice steady. "I designed this building in 1975. I can prove it." "Prove it?" Keller laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're a janitor, Jameson. You push a mop. You clean toilets. Now, you expect people to believe you designed one of Chicago's most iconic buildings?" The words stung, but Harold had endured worse. He thought of his grandchildren, of the legacy they deserved to know. "I was an architect and builder before things changed." "Things changed?" Keller's voice dripped with mockery. "What changed exactly? Did you just wake up one day and decide to become a janitor instead of an architect?" Harold's hands tightened in his lap. "Your father's partner, Mr. Richardson, he took my designs, said no one would believe a colored man designed something this beautiful, told me I could either take a janitor's position or nothing at all." "That's a lie." Keller slammed his hand on the desk. "My father built this company from nothing. Everything we have, we earned." "I earned this too, sir." Harold's voice remained calm, though his heart ached. Every beam, every angle, every detail came from these hands. He held up his worn palms. "I can show you the original blueprints. I kept copies." "Copies can be faked." Keller's face twisted with contempt. "You know what I see, Jameson? I see an old man trying to grab his 15 minutes of fame, trying to cash in on some twisted sense of racial justice." The words echoed painfully in Harold's chest, but he straightened his back. "This isn't about money, Mr. Keller. It's about the truth." "The truth?" Keller circled the desk, looming over Harold. "Here's the truth. You're nothing. You'll always be nothing. And if you don't drop this right now, I'll make sure you spend your retirement pushing a cart through the streets instead of a mop through my building." Harold looked up at the younger man, seeing not just anger but fear in his eyes. Fear of losing what his family had built on lies. "I've pushed that mop for 40 years, Mr. Keller. Cleaned the floors of the building I designed. Watched other men take credit for my work." He stood slowly, his dignity intact, despite his worn uniform. "I accepted it all because I had a family to feed. But I won't stay silent anymore." "Get out!" Keller snarled, snatching the plaque from his desk. "And if I see one more word about this online, you're finished. Understand?" Harold turned toward the door, his steps measured. At the threshold, he paused, looking back at the man who thought he could erase history with threats. "You can't bury the truth forever, Mr. D. Keller. Sooner or later, it finds its way to the light." The door closed behind him with a soft click. In the hallway, Harold's shoulders trembled slightly, but his spine remained straight. Jenny avoided his eyes as he passed her desk. The elevator arrived with a gentle ding, and as Harold stepped inside, he caught his reflection in the polished doors. He saw not just a janitor in a worn uniform, but a builder, an architect, a man who had created beauty from nothing but dreams and determination. The doors closed, and Harold Jameson made his choice. He would not be erased again. Not this time. Not ever again. Harold's worn dress shoes clicked softly against the weathered steps of New Hope Baptist Church. The red brick building had stood on this corner for over 70 years, its stained glass windows gleaming in the early morning sun. He paused at the entrance, straightening his tie, the same one he'd worn every Sunday for the past decade. Inside, the familiar scent of wood polish and old hymnals wrapped around him like a warm embrace. Several congregation members were already seated in the well-loved wooden pews, their conversations a gentle murmur beneath the soft organ music. As Harold made his way down the center aisle, Mrs. Nuppertal Brogger Wilson, an elderly choir member, reached out to squeeze his hand. "We saw that video, Harold," she whispered. "We're all praying for you." Harold nodded, his throat tight. He slipped into his usual spot in the fourth row, the wood creaking beneath him. More church members filtered in, and he noticed their glances, felt their supportive pats on his shoulder. Word had spread fast through their tight-knit community. Pastor Samuel Thompson stood at the pulpit, his silver hair catching the light streaming through the stained glass. His deep voice carried through the sanctuary as he began the service. "Today, we gather not just as individuals, but as a family supporting one of our own." Harold's hands gripped his knees. He hadn't expected this. "Our brother Harold Jameson," Pastor Samuel continued, "has carried a heavy burden for far too long. A burden of injustice, of dignity denied." The pastor's voice grew stronger. "But God sees what man tries to hide. The truth cannot stay buried forever." In the back of the church, Harold spotted Maria slipping in quietly. She wore a simple blue dress, looking younger than her usual business attire at the office. She caught his eye and smiled, taking a seat near the back. Pastor Samuel opened his Bible. In 1 Peter 5:6, we read, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time." He looked directly at Harold. "Sometimes, brothers and sisters, humility means accepting injustice with grace. But other times, true humility means standing up for what's right, not for our own glory, but for the truth itself." The congregation murmured their agreement. Harold felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. "Harold," Pastor Samuel said, stepping down from the pulpit, "would you stand with me?" Harold's legs felt wooden as he rose. The pastor's hand came to rest on his shoulder. This man's hands helped build one of the tallest buildings in our city. His mind designed its graceful lines. But more than that, his spirit, his dignity in the face of prejudice, built something even greater, a testament to perseverance and faith. "Amen!" several voices called out. "We will not let this injustice stand," Pastor Samuel declared. "We will lift our brother up in prayer, yes, but also in action." After the service, people gathered around Harold in the church basement. The usual coffee and cookies became an impromptu strategy session. Sister Jenkins, who worked in local government, offered to make calls. Deacon Williams, a retired lawyer, promised to review any documents Harold could find. Maria moved through the crowd to reach Harold's side. "I knew this was the right place to come today," she said, accepting a coffee cup from Mrs. Wilson. "These people love you, Mr. Jameson." Harold nodded, overwhelmed by the support. "I've been coming here for 40 years, he said softly. "Saw my children baptized here. Buried my Sarah here." He paused, collecting himself. "Never thought I'd need them like this." Pastor Samuel joined them, his presence commanding attention even in the crowded basement. "Harold, Maria, let's sit for a moment." He guided them to a quiet corner. "Maria, I understand you're the one who exposed this situation?" She nodded, suddenly looking uncertain. "I hope I didn't overstep." "No, child," Pastor Samuel assured her. "Sometimes God uses the young to wake up the old." He turned to Harold. "Brother, I know you're scared. But this isn't just about you anymore. It's about every young person who needs to know that truth matters, that justice is worth fighting for." Mrs. Wilson approached their table, her gray hair neatly pinned back. "We've been talking," she said, gesturing to the group behind her. "We want to hold a prayer vigil, right in front of that building you built." "A peaceful witness," Pastor Samuel nodded. Let them see that Harold isn't alone. Harold looked at his weathered hands, remembering how they once held blueprints instead of mops. I don't want to cause trouble. Standing for truth isn't trouble, Maria said firmly. It's necessary. The basement hummed with energy as people began to plan. Sister Jenkins was already calling other churches. Deacon Williams had pulled out his phone to check permit requirements for public gatherings. Mrs. Y had F. Wilson was organizing a phone tree to spread the word. Wednesday evening, Pastor Samuel decided. We'll gather at sunset, candles, prayers, and songs. He looked at Harold. If you're willing. Harold thought of the plaque hidden in his apartment, his name etched in metal proof of his contribution. He thought of his grandchildren asking why he never fought back. He thought of Maria, young and brave, risking her future to stand with him. I'm willing, he said finally. God help me, I'm willing. The basement erupted in quiet approval. Mrs. Wilson began humming, We Shall Overcome, and others joined in softly. Maria's hand found Harold's and squeezed it. Pastor Samuel stood, his voice carrying over the gentle singing. Then, let's prepare. We'll need permits, candles, chairs for the elderly. He began assigning tasks, his organizational skills showing why he'd led this congregation for so long. Harold sat quietly, watching his church family mobilize around him. Maria remained by his side, taking notes on her phone, already creating social media events and group chats to coordinate everything. Mr. Jameson, she said softly, this is just the beginning. But you're not alone anymore. The morning light streamed through the basement windows, catching the dust motes in its beams. Harold watched his community coming together, their love and support wrapping around him like a shield. For the first time since finding that plaque, he felt truly ready to face whatever came next. As the planning continued around him, Harold closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. The church that had sustained him through loss and hardship was now becoming his army of angels, ready to stand with him in his fight for truth. Monday morning arrived with a crispness in the autumn air. Harold stepped off the bus at his usual stop, his weathered lunch bag clutched in one hand. But today was different. As he approached the gleaming glass doors of the skyscraper, a small crowd of reporters huddled near the entrance, their cameras and microphones at the ready. Mr. Jameson, one called out, spotting him. Is it true you designed this building? Can you tell us about the discrimination you faced in the 1970s? Another pressed. Harold's steps faltered. He hadn't expected this. The familiar security guard, Tom, stepped forward to clear a path for him, but the reporters persisted. How does it feel to clean the building you built? A young woman in a navy blazer thrust her microphone toward him. Harold's throat tightened. He'd spent decades walking through these doors unnoticed, invisible. Now all these eyes were on him, all these voices calling his name. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his employee badge. I just want to do my job, he said softly. But the reporters leaned in closer to catch his words. Inside the lobby, clusters of employees whispered and pointed. Some offered encouraging smiles, while others quickly looked away. Harold's mop bucket waited in its usual corner, but before he could reach it, Maria appeared at his side. Harold, you need to see this. She held up her phone, showing him social media posts about his story. It's everywhere. People are demanding answers. Just then, the elevator doors opened with a sharp ding. Brad Keller strode out, flanked by 3 men in expensive suits. Their polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as they approached. Mr. Jameson, one of the lawyers said, his voice coolly professional. I'm Richard Whitman from Sterling Associates. We need to discuss these unfortunate allegations you're spreading. Harold straightened his back, though his heart hammered in his chest. They're not allegations, they're the truth. Keller's face reddened. The truth? You're a janitor trying to claim credit for something you couldn't possibly have done. Do you know how ridiculous that sounds? Several employees had stopped to watch the confrontation. Maria stepped closer to Harold, her presence offering silent support. Mr. Whitman, Keller snapped. Handle this. I have actual business to attend to. He stormed off toward the front doors, where security was still holding back the reporters. The lawyer pulled out a thick manila envelope. Mr. Jameson, We have documentation proving you were employed merely as part of the cleaning crew during construction. Your claims are not only false, but potentially damaging to this company's reputation. We're prepared to take legal action unless you issue an immediate retraction." Harold's fingers curled into fists at his sides. The familiar weight of injustice settled on his shoulders, but this time it felt different. This time, he wasn't alone. "Those papers are lies," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I have the original plaque. I have my blueprints at home. And there are people still alive who remember the truth." "A janitor with blueprints?" Whitman's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Mr. Jameson, be reasonable. You're risking your job and what little reputation you have. Sign this retraction, and we can all move on." Maria stepped forward. "He doesn't have to sign anything. And you should know there are witnesses outside right now who worked with Harold in the 70s. They're telling their stories to those reporters." The lawyer's confident expression flickered for just a moment. He thrust the envelope toward Harold. "Review these documents. You have until tomorrow to make the right decision." With that, he turned and strode toward the elevators, his colleagues following in his wake. Harold stood rooted to the spot, aware of the eyes still watching him. The morning sun streamed through the vast windows, catching on the brass fixtures he'd polished countless times. His gaze traveled up the soaring atrium, taking in every detail he'd carefully designed all those years ago. The graceful curve of the balconies, the precise angle of the support columns, the way the light played across the space, exactly as he'd envisioned it. Maria touched his arm gently. "Harold, are you okay?" He nodded slowly, memories flooding back of the days he'd spent directing construction, solving problems, bringing his vision to life. He remembered the pride he'd felt seeing it rise floor by floor, even as others took credit for his work. He remembered the pain of being forced to take a janitor's position just to stay close to his creation. The morning cleaning cart waited in its usual spot, but Harold didn't move toward it. Instead, he stood straighter, his chin lifting as he gazed up at the towering ceiling he'd designed. Decades of quiet dignity and swallowed pride crystallized into something stronger, something that wouldn't be buried anymore. "I built you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then, with quiet determination, he added, "Now, I'll fight for you." The downtown library stood like a grand old lady as dusk settled over Chicago. Inside, beneath the warm glow of brass reading lamps, Harold and Maria hunched over a microfilm reader in the archives section. The machine's soft whirring filled the quiet space as Maria carefully wound through decades-old newspapers. "Slow down a bit," Harold said softly, his eyes fixed on the scrolling images. "There. Stop there." Maria froze the frame. The headline read, "Downtown Development Continues, dated July 1975. Harold leaned closer, squinting at the grainy black and white photo beneath the text. His younger self stood at the construction site, rolled blueprints tucked under his arm, pointing upward at the rising steel skeleton of what would become their skyscraper. "That's me," he whispered, his finger trembling slightly as he touched the screen. "I remember that day. We just finished the 20th floor." Maria grabbed her phone and snapped a picture of the article. "You look so confident there," she said, studying the image. "Like you knew exactly what you were doing." "I did." Harold's voice carried a quiet pride. "Every beam, every joint, it was all up here." He tapped his temple. "I'd spent nights dreaming about this building before we even broke ground." They continued searching, Maria's fingers flying over the library's computer keyboard as she cross-referenced dates and events. Harold watched her work, amazed by how quickly she navigated the digital archives. "Look at this one," she said, pulling up another article. This time, the photograph showed Harold reviewing blueprints with a construction crew. Though the photo was black and white, Harold remembered the vibrant yellow of their hard hats, the deep blue of the autumn sky that day. "Those men," Harold said, pointing to the crew members. "Bobby Thompson, Mike Rivera, Will Jefferson. Good men, all of them. Wonder if any are still around." Maria jotted down the names in her notebook. "We could try to find them. Their testimony would help prove your involvement." The library's ancient heating system creaked and sighed as they worked. Outside the tall windows, city lights began twinkling in the growing darkness. Harold's back ached from bending over the microfilm reader, but he couldn't stop. Each discovered photograph felt like recovering a piece of himself that had been lost. They found more. Harold directing crane operators, Harold conferring with suppliers, Harold standing proud at the topping-off ceremony, though his name wasn't mentioned in any of the captions. Instead, the credit always went to others: the development company, the official architects, the project managers. "They really did try to erase you," Maria said softly, her voice tight with anger. She pulled up another article, this one announcing the building's completion. The photograph showed the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Harold spotted himself in the background, partially cropped out of the frame. "Look how they pushed you to the edge," Maria said, "literally pushing you out of the picture." Harold nodded slowly. "That's how it was back then. They needed my skills, my knowledge, but they didn't want my face front and center. Too many people weren't ready to accept that a black man could design something so magnificent." Maria reached over and squeezed his hand. "Well, they're going to have to accept it now." They worked methodically, creating digital copies of everything they found. Maria organized the files on her laptop, building a timeline of the construction through the photographs and articles. Harold's memory remained sharp, providing context for each image, details about construction challenges they'd overcome, innovations he'd implemented, problems he'd solved. "See that support structure there?" he said, pointing to one photo. "That was my design. The original plans wouldn't have worked with Chicago's winds. I redesigned it to make the building more stable." Maria zoomed in on the detail. "Can you explain how it works?" Harold's eyes lit up as he described the engineering principles, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. For a moment, he wasn't the janitor anymore. He was the builder again, the architect, the man who had reached for the sky and succeeded. The library's closing announcement echoed through the quiet building, startling them both. Maria checked her watch, surprised to find it was already 9 o'clock. "We've got enough evidence to start building our case," she said, carefully packing up her laptop. She pulled out the flash drive where she'd saved their discoveries. "These photos prove you were there, that you were involved in every aspect of the construction." Harold stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting so long. He looked at the stack of photocopies they'd made, proof of his past, his legacy, his truth. Each image was a weapon against the lies that had buried him. Maria's eyes sparkled with determination as she gathered their research. "Mr. Jameson, these photos are just the beginning. We're going to find those construction workers. We're going to get statements from everyone who remembers. We're going to prove that this building, every inch of it, came from your mind and your hands." As they walked toward the library's exit, Harold felt lighter than he had in years. Each step seemed to carry him further from the shadow of shame and silence he'd lived under for so long. They paused at the library's entrance. Through the glass doors, they could see their skyscraper in the distance, its windows glowing against the night sky. Maria turned to Harold, her face bright with excitement and purpose. "This is only the beginning," she grinned. Harold sat in his small kitchen, phone book open on the scratched wooden table. His weathered fingers traced down columns of names, while Maria typed quickly on her laptop nearby. Outside, spring rain tapped against the window, a gentle backdrop to their determined search. "Here's another one," Maria said, turning her screen. Thomas Wheeler worked construction in Chicago from '68 to '82. She had spent hours combing through union records and social media, hunting for Harold's old crew members. Harold adjusted his reading glasses, squinting at the name. His face softened with recognition. Tommy Wheeler. Best crane operator I ever worked with. Had hands steady as a surgeon. He picked up his ancient landline phone, the coiled cord stretched and kinked from years of use. His hand trembled slightly as he dialed. 3 rings, then a gruff voice answered. "Hello, Tommy? This is Harold Jameson." A long pause filled the line. Then, "Harold? Harold from the Madison Project? Lord have mercy, is it really you?" Harold's eyes grew misty. "It's me, Tommy. Been a long time." "Too long. What's got you calling after all these years?" Harold cleared his throat. "Tommy, I need to ask you about the tower, about what you remember." "Remember, Harold? I remember everything. You were the brains behind that whole operation. Your designs. Your leadership. Tommy's voice grew animated. Hold on. I'm only 15 minutes away. This ain't a phone conversation. I'm coming over. Within half an hour, Tommy Wheeler's old pickup truck rattled into the apartment complex parking lot. Harold watched from his window as a tall, thin man with snow-white hair carefully climbed out, using a cane for support. When Harold opened his door, both men stood silent for a moment, taking in how time had changed them. Then they embraced like brothers. "Look at us," Tommy chuckled, wiping his eyes. "Couple of old war horses." Maria pulled up a chair as the men settled at the kitchen table. Tommy's eyes were sharp despite his age, and his memory sharper still. "Those innovative support beams you designed," Tommy said, sketching with his finger on the table. "Nobody had seen anything like that before. The way you calculated the wind forces adjusted for the lake effect. Pure genius." Harold nodded slowly. "You remember the drawings?" "Remember them? I still have some." Tommy thumped his cane on the floor. "Got a whole box in my garage. Never could bring myself to throw them away, especially after what they did to you." Maria leaned forward eagerly. "Sir, would you be willing to sign a statement about what you remember?" "Statement? Girl, I'll shout it from the rooftops." Tommy's face hardened. What they did wasn't right. Stealing a man's work, his dream, just because of the color of his skin. The phone calls continued through the afternoon. Each number led to another, as old crew members remembered others. Harold's small apartment slowly filled with elderly men, their voices growing stronger as they shared their memories. Bill Martinez, now 82, had been a junior architect. He arrived, clutching yellowed photographs, showing Harold at the construction site, pointing at blueprints, directing crews. "You taught me everything I know about urban design," he said, his accent still thick after 50 years in Chicago. Frank O'Malley, former steel worker, brought his union logs. "Look here," he said, jabbing a gnarled finger at the pages. "Every major design decision signed off by H. Jameson, clear as day. Even Jimmy Chen, retired safety inspector, made the trip from Milwaukee." He walked with 2 canes but insisted on standing as he spoke. Harold ran the tightest ship in Chicago. Not one serious accident on his watch. He thought of everything, planned for everything. The men's stories flowed like a river of truth, washing away decades of silence. They spoke of Harold's quiet authority, his brilliant solutions to engineering challenges, his respect for every worker on site. As evening approached, more kept arriving. Sons and daughters drove their elderly fathers, some in wheelchairs, others moving slowly but determined to be there. The small apartment could barely contain them all. "Remember that brutal winter of '71?" called out Pete Davidson, former electrician. "Harold got us all better gear, paid from his own pocket. Wouldn't let us work without proper protection. And the time the foundation plan showed that underground stream?" added George Williams, who'd run the concrete crews. "Harold redesigned the whole bottom structure in 2 days. Saved the project millions." Maria moved among them with her laptop, recording statements, scanning old documents, preserving every precious memory. Harold sat quietly at the center of it all, overcome by the outpouring of support. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the kitchen window, most of the men had to leave, but Tommy Wheeler remained. He stood with difficulty, leaning on his cane, and faced Harold. "You know what gets me?" Tommy's voice was thick with emotion. "All these years, they tried to erase you. But look around. Every one of us carried the truth. We knew who really built that tower." He extended his hand, weathered and spotted with age, to Harold. Their handshake was firm, a grip forged in steel and concrete decades ago. "You built this city, Harold," Tommy said softly. "And not just that tower. You built us too. Made us better men than we would have been without you." The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold's worn kitchen table as he sipped his coffee, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the Chicago Tribune. There, on the front page of the local section, was his face. Not a small mention buried in the back, but a large photograph of him standing proud in his work uniform against the backdrop of the skyscraper he'd built decades ago. The forgotten builder. The untold story of Harold Jameson. The headline declared in bold letters. Harold had to remove his reading glasses and wipe his eyes before continuing. The article was thorough, presenting evidence Maria had helped gather from the archives. There were old construction photos showing Harold directing crews, pointing at blueprints, and consulting with contractors. The journalist, Sarah Chen, had done her homework, interviewing several of Harold's former co-workers who'd come forward to verify his role. Mr. Jameson's innovative structural solutions saved the project millions. One quote read from Tom McKinley, a retired engineer. "That curved support beam design? That was all Harold. We'd never seen anything like it before." Harold's phone began ringing. First his daughter Patricia, then his son Michael, and finally his grandchildren, all calling to tell him they'd seen the article. "Grandpa, you're famous!" his youngest granddaughter squealed through the phone. When Harold arrived at work that morning, something felt different. The security guard, Pete, who'd always been friendly, stood up and actually saluted him. "Sir," Pete said with genuine respect, "it's an honor to work with you." Through the glass doors, Harold could see a small group gathering on the sidewalk. As he watched, more people joined them. Some carried handmade signs, "Justice for Harold," and "Honor the True Builder," and "Black Excellence Can't Be Erased." Maria burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement. "Harold, have you seen Twitter? Your story is trending. People are sharing their own stories of being denied credit for their work. You've started a movement." Harold's hands gripped his mop handle, not out of anger this time, but to steady himself. The lobby television was tuned to a local news station, and there was his story again, with reporters interviewing people on the street. "It's disgusting how they treated him," one woman said to the camera. "This building stands because of his genius, and they made him clean its floors?" More people arrived outside. Harold recognized faces from his church, including Pastor Samuel leading a group in prayer. There were students from local colleges, business people on their lunch breaks, and elderly citizens who remembered the building's construction. The crowd had grown so large that police arrived to direct traffic around them. But this wasn't an angry mob, it was a gathering of support, of recognition, of long-delayed justice. Brad Keller stormed through the lobby, his face red with fury. He jabbed a finger at Harold. "This is your fault. These people are disrupting business." But this time, Harold didn't flinch or look away. He stood straight, his dignity intact. "Mr. Keller," Harold said quietly, but with steel in his voice, "the truth disrupts lies every time." Several employees nearby overheard and broke into spontaneous applause. Keller retreated to his elevator, leaving Harold standing tall in the lobby he'd designed all those years ago. Throughout the day, more reporters arrived. Harold kept working. He had his duties, after all, but every so often, he'd pause at one of the massive windows overlooking the street. The crowd continued to grow. Someone had brought a sound system, and gospel music floated up from below, the same songs Harold hummed while he worked. During his lunch break, Harold sat in the break room, overwhelmed by messages of support on his phone. His grandson had helped him set up a social media account, and thousands of people were following him, sharing his story, demanding justice. "Harold," Maria said, joining him with tears in her eyes, "look at this." She showed him her phone, where a major architectural magazine had picked up the story. They were planning a feature on his innovative design elements, comparing them to modern standards. "They're calling you a pioneer," she said proudly. In the afternoon, a group of architecture students from the local university arrived with detailed analyses of the building's design. They'd studied the original blueprints Maria had found, and were amazed by Harold's solutions to complex structural challenges. "Sir," one student said, holding up technical drawings, "the way you handled the wind load issues, it was decades ahead of its time. We're studying your methods in our advanced classes now." As the day drew to a close, Harold stood at the window of the 40th floor, looking down at the sea of supporters. Some had brought folding chairs and coolers, settling in for a long stay. Others had strung up lights, creating a warm glow in the gathering dusk. He pressed his hand against the cool glass, feeling the subtle vibration of the building, his building. He remembered every decision, every calculation, every sleepless night spent perfecting the designs. He remembered the pride of seeing it rise floor by floor, and the crushing pain of having it all stolen away. But now, watching the crowds below, Harold felt something new rising in his chest. Hope. Not bitter resignation, not quiet acceptance, but real, powerful hope. His story was being heard. His work was being recognized. His legacy was finally emerging from the shadows. A custodial cart squeaked behind him, and Harold turned to see Maria approaching with a small group of his former crew members who'd been interviewed for the article. They'd come to stand with him. "Look at that, Harold," said Frank, his old foreman, now stooped with age but still sharp-eyed. "They can't bury the truth forever. Your building's still standing, and now everyone knows who really built it." Harold nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He turned back to the window, watching the growing crowd below, their candles and phone lights twinkling like earthbound stars. Each light represented someone who now knew his story, who understood what had been taken from him, who stood for justice. For the first time in decades, Harold felt truly seen. Harold was washing windows on the 42nd floor when his cell phone buzzed in his pocket. He rarely got calls during work hours, except from his grandchildren. Wiping his hands on his uniform, he answered with a cautious, "Hello? Mr. Jameson?" A crisp, professional voice spoke. "This is Amanda Chen from the mayor's office. Do you have a moment?" Harold's heart skipped a beat. He set down his cleaning supplies and moved away from the window. "Yes, ma'am, I do. The mayor would like to honor you with a recognition ceremony at City Hall next Friday. Your contributions to Chicago's architectural heritage deserve proper acknowledgement." Harold steadied himself against the wall, his legs suddenly weak. "A ceremony?" he repeated softly. "Yes, sir. We're planning to present you with a City Excellence Award. Would you be available at 2 p.m. next Friday?" Through the spotless window he'd just cleaned, Harold could see the whole city spread out before him, the same view he'd imagined while drafting blueprints all those years ago. Yes, I would." After hanging up, Harold stood motionless for several minutes, watching his reflection in the glass. His uniform was clean but worn, his shoes scuffed from years of work. He couldn't appear at City Hall looking like this. During her lunch break, Maria found him in the basement supply room, organizing cleaning supplies with unusual intensity. "Harold, I just heard the news." She rushed in, her face glowing with excitement. "We need to get you a suit." He shook his head. "I can't afford anything fancy, child. You're not paying for it." Maria's tone left no room for argument. "My whole family wants to contribute. You're going to look amazing." That afternoon, Maria drove Harold to a men's clothing store downtown. The shop was elegant, with warm lighting and dark wood paneling. Harold hesitated at the entrance, feeling out of place. "Come on," Maria encouraged, taking his arm. "You belong here just as much as anyone else." A young sales associate approached them, his smile genuine. "How can I help you today?" Before Harold could speak, Maria stepped forward. "We need a suit for my friend here. He's being honored at City Hall next week." The associate's eyes lit up. "I saw the article. You're Mr. Jameson, aren't you? The builder they wrote about?" Harold nodded, surprised to be recognized. "It would be my pleasure to help you find something perfect for the occasion." For the next hour, Harold tried on different suits, while Maria and the associate offered opinions. They finally settled on a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly. The fabric was fine but not flashy, elegant but understated, just like Harold himself. "Look at yourself," Maria said softly, leading him to a full-length mirror. Harold stood straight, taking in his reflection. The suit transformed him, not into someone different, but into the person he'd always been beneath the janitor's uniform. He saw in the mirror the architect, the builder, the man who had designed a piece of Chicago's skyline. "The alterations will be ready tomorrow," the associate said. "We'll make sure everything is perfect." Back in his apartment that evening, Harold hung the garment bag carefully in his closet. On his dresser sat a small framed photograph of his late wife Mary, smiling at him from 20 years ago. He picked it up, his thumb brushing across the glass. "I wish you could see this, Mary," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She had been there during the hardest years, when his dreams of being an architect seemed impossible. She had never lost faith in him, even when he'd lost faith in himself. He set the photo down gently, remembering how she'd always told him to stand tall, no matter what anyone said. Next Friday, he would do just that. The suit hung in his closet like a promise, not just of the ceremony to come, but of a truth finally being acknowledged. Harold touched the sleeve one last time before getting ready for bed, knowing that when he wore it, he would carry not just his own dignity, but Mary's love and faith as well. In the quiet of his bedroom, Harold studied the suit's silhouette in the dim light. It represented more than just fine fabric and careful tailoring. It was a symbol of restoration, of a wrong finally being made right. He smiled at Mary's photo once more, knowing that somehow, somewhere, she was smiling back. The security guard winked at Harold and Maria as they slipped through the service entrance after hours. Even at night, Chicago's downtown hummed with life, a symphony of distant sirens and rumbling trains. Harold's weathered hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the maintenance door to the rooftop stairs. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Jameson?" Maria asked, her young face glowing in the dim emergency lights. Harold nodded, his voice soft but certain. "Been cleaning these stairs for 20 years. Tonight, I want to see my building from the top." They climbed slowly, Harold's knees protesting each step. Maria matched his pace, patient and protective. When they finally reached the rooftop door, the cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain-washed concrete. The Chicago skyline sparkled around them like earthbound stars. Harold walked to the edge, his hands gripping the safety railing. Below, traffic moved in ribbons of red and white lights. The city he'd helped build stretched out before him, a testament to countless hours of labor and dreams. Maria settled beside him, her intern's badge catching the light. "It's beautiful up here." "Used to come up here every day during construction," Harold said, his voice thick with memory. "Back then, it was just steel beams and hope." He paused, running his hand along the smooth metal railing. "The contractor wanted standard steel supports, but I knew we needed something stronger for Chicago winds. Fought him for weeks on that." "You really thought of everything," Maria said softly. Harold's shoulders slumped slightly. "Had to. Being the only black architect on site meant every decision was questioned twice." He gazed out at the city. "First day on the job, the white foreman made me use the service entrance. Told me no colored man could walk through the front door, even if I designed the thing." Maria's hand tightened on the railing. "That's horrible. That was just the beginning." Harold's voice grew distant. "Had a white partner back then, James Morton. He'd present my designs as his own in meetings. Said clients wouldn't trust a black architect." He shook his head slowly. "One day, I came to work and found my name stripped from everything. Morton had filed the patents in his name, claimed sole credit. But how could he do that?" Maria's voice cracked with indignation. Times were different. No one would take my word over his. Harold pulled out an old creased photo from his wallet. "This is the only picture I have from those days. Me and the crew, raising the first beam." Maria studied the faded image, a younger Harold, standing proud in a hard hat, his smile bright against the Chicago sky. "You look so happy." "I was. Thought I was building something that would last. Something my grandchildren could point to and say, 'My grandpa built that.'" He tucked the photo away carefully. "Instead, I ended up pushing a mop through the building I designed." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind whistling between the surrounding towers. Maria wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. "You know what hurt the most?" Harold continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Watching other men take credit for my work, seeing them get rich off my ideas, while I could barely keep food on the table for my family." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "My wife Mary, God rest her soul, she'd tell me to keep my head high. 'They can't steal your talent,' she'd say." Maria touched his arm gently. "She was right, Mr. Jameson." Harold nodded, a sad smile crossing his face. "She always was, but there were dark days, child. Days when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear." He gestured at the surrounding buildings. I watched this city grow up around me, knowing pieces of my soul were locked inside these towers, but nobody knew, nobody cared. But they care now, Maria reminded him. Tomorrow, everyone will know the truth. Harold turned to face her, his eyes glistening in the city lights. Because of you, child. You weren't afraid to speak up when you saw wrong being done. He shook his head in wonder. In my day, nobody would have dared challenge men like Keller. Times are changing, Mr. Jameson. People are listening now. Harold looked out over the city again, standing straighter. The wind pulled at his jacket, but he seemed stronger somehow, more resolved. You know something? Standing up here, looking at my building. His voice caught for a moment. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but his smile was radiant. For the first time in decades, I feel like I'm standing tall again. The city lights twinkled below them, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled. Harold and Maria stood together on the rooftop, witness to a moment of long-delayed justice, as Chicago's night sky wrapped around them like a blessing. The morning sun cast long shadows across City Hall Plaza as Harold adjusted his new tie with trembling fingers. The crisp autumn air carried the excited chatter of hundreds of people gathering for the ceremony. Children waved handmade signs, reading "Justice for Harold" and "Honor the True Builder." Church members from his congregation dotted the crowd in their Sunday best, sharing proud smiles. Maria stood beside Harold in a powder blue dress, squeezing his arm reassuringly. "Look at all these people here to support you," she whispered. Harold's chest swelled with emotion as he watched his grandchildren running between the rows of chairs set up for the occasion. His grandson, Tommy, just 7 years old, wore a tiny clip-on tie that matched Harold's. The sight brought tears to his eyes. "Never thought I'd see this day," Harold murmured, his voice thick. The marble steps of City Hall seemed to glow in the morning light. A podium stood ready at the top, adorned with the city seal. The mayor's aide approached, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Jameson, we're ready to begin in 15 minutes. If you could join the dignitaries." But before Harold could take a step, a commotion erupted at the edge of the plaza. Brad Keller strode through the crowd, flanked by 3 men in expensive suits clutching leather briefcases. His face wore a triumphant smirk that made Harold's stomach turn. "I'm afraid this little celebration is premature," Keller announced loudly, his voice carrying across the plaza. The crowd fell silent as the lawyers began distributing packets to reporters. "What we have here," Keller continued, "are the original employment records from 1975 to 1978. He held up a yellowed document. "Mr. Jameson was employed as a maintenance worker during construction. Nothing more." The lawyers stepped forward, opening their briefcases on a nearby table. They pulled out more papers, time cards, pay stubs, work orders, all seemingly authentic with faded stamps and signatures. "These records clearly show Mr. Jameson's position," one lawyer declared. "He was part of the cleaning crew, maintaining the site during construction. Any claims of being the builder are frankly fabricated." Reporters swarmed forward, cameras flashing. Harold stood rooted to the spot, the world spinning around him. The documents looked real, weathered and official. But they were lies. All lies. "Mr. Jameson," a reporter shouted, "how do you explain these records? Harold, is it true you were just part of the maintenance staff? Were you trying to take credit for someone else's work?" The questions came like punches, each one striking deeper than the last. Harold opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat felt tight, choking on decades of injustice. Maria stepped forward angrily. "Those documents are fake. We have proof." But her voice was drowned out as more reporters pressed closer, their microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Mr. Jameson, did you mislead the public? Was this all a publicity stunt?" The mayor's aide returned, looking flustered. "I'm sorry, but given these new developments, we'll need to postpone the ceremony pending further investigation." Harold watched as city workers began folding up the chairs, dismantling the podium. His grandchildren stood confused at the edge of the crowd, their small faces worried. Church members whispered among themselves, shooting him uncertain glances. The crowd that had gathered to honor him began to disperse. leaving behind discarded signs and programs that fluttered across the plaza like fallen leaves. Each departing footstep echoed in Harold's ears like a hammer falling. Keller approached, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "Nothing personal," he said softly, so only Harold could hear. "Just business. Know your place, old man." Harold's legs felt weak. The new suit that had made him feel so proud now seemed to hang heavy on his shoulders, like chains. Maria tried to hold his arm, but he gently pulled away. I need some air," he mumbled. He walked slowly across the plaza, past the questioning looks and whispered conversations. His shoes scraped against the concrete, the same worn shoes Keller had mocked. Each step felt heavier than the last until he reached a park bench facing the river. Harold sank onto the bench, his shoulders slumping. The morning sun that had seemed so bright now felt cold and distant. He stared at his calloused hands, hands that had measured, cut, and built. Hands that knew every beam and girder of that skyscraper. But now, those same hands trembled with age and defeat. The plaque he'd found, the photos, the testimonies of old friends, all of it swept away by a stack of forged papers. How could paper lies weigh more than steel truth? A dried leaf skittered across the ground at his feet. Harold watched it dance away on the breeze, feeling just as weightless and lost. The city stretched above him, glass towers reaching toward the sky. His dreams, now seemed to mock him from above. He pulled his wife's worn photo from his pocket, her smile unchanged after all these years. "Oh, Mary," he whispered, "maybe I was fool to think they'd ever let me have my moment." A tear fell onto the photograph, and Harold quickly wiped it away with his thumb. The sounds of the city faded to a distant hum as Harold sat motionless on the bench, feeling every one of his 68 years pressing down upon him. The weight of broken dreams, stolen credit, and fresh humiliation bent his shoulders until he seemed to fold in on himself, a man collapsing under the weight of injustice. The morning that had dawned with such promise now felt dark as midnight, and Harold Jamieson, builder, dreamer, fighter, sat alone on a park bench, defeated at last. The streetlights cast long shadows through Harold's apartment window, their dim glow barely reaching the kitchen table where he sat. The dedication plaque lay before him, its brass surface catching what little light filtered in. His weathered fingers traced over his name, feeling each engraved letter that proved his truth. "Chief designer and builder, Harold Jamieson," he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. The silence felt heavy, pressing down on his shoulders like the weight of all those years of silence. He hadn't even turned on the lights when he got home. Somehow, the darkness matched his mood better. His good suit, the one he'd bought for the ceremony, hung on the bedroom door, a reminder of his foolishness. How could he have believed things would change? That justice would finally come? The price tag still dangled from the sleeve, mocking him with its newness. Harold's eyes drifted to the family photos on his wall, barely visible in the gloom. His late wife Mary's smile seemed to dim in the darkness. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he murmured. "I should have kept quiet, kept my head down like always." The television remote sat untouched. He couldn't bear to watch the news, to see them talk about him like he was a liar, a fraud. His phone had been ringing all evening. His grandchildren, church members, even some reporters. He'd unplugged the landline and turned off his cell phone. Those forged documents flashed in his mind, crisp white papers with official-looking stamps, making him out to be nothing more than a janitor even back then. His hands clenched into fists. 50 years of his life, his work, his dreams, all dismissed with a few sheets of paper. The bitter taste of coffee gone cold lingered in his mouth. The cup sat half empty on the table, just like the pot of collard greens he'd made that morning, now forgotten on the stove. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, but hunger seemed distant, unimportant. His humming had stopped. For the first time in years, no gospel tunes came to his lips. Even Amazing Grace, his constant companion during dark times, felt trapped somewhere deep in his chest. The building plans he and Maria had found in the archives lay scattered across the table. His own handwriting covered the margins, notes about support beams, material calculations, innovative solutions to engineering challenges. But what good were they now? Who would believe an old janitor over a powerful CEO? A police siren wailed somewhere in the distance, and Harold flinched. It reminded him of that morning in 1973 when the police had escorted him from the construction site after his partner claimed he'd stolen the designs. He'd been lucky to avoid arrest then. Now here he was, nearly 50 years later, being called a thief of his own legacy all over again. The worn Bible on his nightstand caught his eye. How many times had he read about David facing Goliath? About Moses standing up to Pharaoh? But those were great men, chosen by God. He was just Harold Jamison, a janitor with worn-out shoes and calloused hands. A soft knock at the door broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Jamison?" Maria's voice called out, gentle but insistent. "Please, I know you're in there. We can't let them win like this." Harold stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Another knock came, louder this time. "Mr. Jamison, the church is organizing a protest. People believe you. We have proof. Real proof. Those documents they showed today, we can prove they're fake." His heart ached at the hope in her young voice. She reminded him so much of himself at that age, believing that truth would always triumph, that justice was inevitable if you fought hard enough. "Please," Maria's voice cracked slightly. "Don't give up. Not now. Not after everything." Harold's eyes burned with unshed tears. He wanted to tell her to go home, to save herself from fighting battles that couldn't be won, to keep her own dreams safe and small where they couldn't be stolen. The plaque caught the light again, his name glinting in the darkness. Chief designer and builder. The truth was right there in his hands, but sometimes the truth wasn't enough. Sometimes the world wasn't ready to hear it. Maria knocked again, more desperately now. "Mr. Jameson? Please, just let me know you're okay." He closed his eyes, letting the tears finally fall. The sound of her knocking echoed through his quiet apartment, but Harold remained seated in the darkness, silent and still, clutching the only proof he had left of who he truly was. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of Greater Hope Baptist Church, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews. Harold sat in his usual spot near the back, his shoulders slumped and his eyes fixed on the hymnal in his lap. He hadn't wanted to come today, but decades of Sunday worship had pulled him here like muscle memory. The congregation swayed to "Amazing Grace," but Harold's lips barely moved. His mind kept drifting back to those forged documents, to the skeptical faces of the reporters, to his own reflection in the mirror, wearing that new suit he'd never get to use. Pastor Samuel Thompson stood at the pulpit, his dignified presence drawing every eye in the sanctuary. His deep voice carried authority earned through years of shepherding this flock through their darkest moments. The silver in his hair caught the morning light as he opened his Bible. "Brothers and sisters," Pastor Samuel began, his voice warm but firm, "today we're going to talk about rejection, about what it means to be cast aside by those who think themselves mighty." Harold shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sister Williams, who always sat 2 pews ahead, turned to give him a sympathetic smile. "Turn with me to Psalm 118, verse 22, Pastor Samuel continued. His finger traced the well-worn page of his Bible. "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." The words hit Harold like a physical force. His hands began to tremble. "Now, some of you might be wondering what this means," Pastor Samuel said, stepping away from the pulpit to walk closer to the congregation. In ancient times, builders would inspect stones carefully. They'd look for any flaw, any weakness, and sometimes they'd cast aside a stone they thought wasn't good enough. The pastor's eyes found Harold's, holding his gaze with compassion. But God, in His infinite wisdom, often takes what others reject and makes it the very foundation of His greatest works. Murmurs of amen rippled through the church. Harold felt tears beginning to well up in his eyes. "We have someone in our congregation today," Pastor Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger, "who knows what it means to be rejected, to have his work denied, his truth buried, his dignity challenged." Several people turned to look at Harold, not with pity, but with love and support. "But let me tell you something about rejection," the pastor declared. "It's not the end of the story. No, it's often just the beginning of God's greatest work in our lives." Harold wiped his eyes with a handkerchief as Pastor Samuel shared stories from Scripture. Of Joseph sold into slavery by his brothers only to become a ruler in Egypt. Of David overlooked by his father but chosen by God to be king. "The world may reject you," Pastor Samuel's voice thundered, "but God never will. The world may try to bury your truth, but truth is like a seed. Bury it, and it grows." The congregation burst into applause and shouts of agreement. Maria, sitting in the row across from Harold, reached over and squeezed his hand. "Some of you may remember," Pastor Samuel continued, his voice softening, "when Harold Jameson used to lead our building committee. When he'd check our roof after every storm, fix our heating system in the dead of winter. His hands built more than just skyscrapers. They built hope in this community." Harold remembered those days. The satisfaction of using his skills to serve his church family, of teaching young men basic carpentry, of knowing his work mattered. "The stone the builders rejected," Pastor Samuel repeated, letting each word land with purpose, "has become the cornerstone, not might become, not could become, has become. The rejection is past tense, but the victory is present tense." The church erupted in praise. Sister Williams was on her feet, hands raised. Brother Johnson, who'd worked with Harold back in the day, shouted, "Tell it, Pastor!" "Harold," Pastor Samuel said, looking directly at him, "your story isn't over. Those who tried to reject you, to erase you, they don't get to write the ending. God does, and He specializes in resurrection stories." Harold couldn't hold back his tears now. They flowed freely down his cheeks as decades of pain, frustration, and suppressed anger began to break loose. "Sometimes," the pastor continued, "God allows us to be rejected so that our victory can be a testament. So that others can see that rejection isn't final, that truth cannot be buried forever, that dignity cannot be stolen, it can only be surrendered." The words penetrated Harold's heart like arrows of light, dispersing the darkness that had settled there since the ceremony's cancellation. "The question isn't whether you've been rejected," Pastor Samuel declared. "The question is, what will you do with that rejection? Will you let it define you, or will you let God transform it into your cornerstone?" Harold felt something stirring in his spirit, a familiar fire he thought had been extinguished. He remembered standing on construction sites, confident in his vision, leading crews of men who respected his expertise. He remembered the pride in his wife Mary's eyes when he'd show her his blueprints. "The stone the builders rejected," Pastor Samuel said one final time, his voice filled with holy conviction, "has become the cornerstone, not by accident, not by chance, but by God's divine design." The organ began to play softly as the pastor bowed his head in prayer. But before he could speak, Harold rose to his feet. His voice, though shaking with emotion, carried clearly through the sanctuary. "I'll fight," he declared, standing tall despite his tears. One last time, the evening sun cast long shadows through Judge Richard Holloway's study as he sat in his leather armchair reading the newspaper article about Harold Jameson. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he recognized the face in the grainy construction photo, a face that had haunted his conscience for over 40 years. "Dear Lord," he whispered, adjusting his reading glasses, "it's really him." The judge's eyes drifted to an old filing cabinet in the corner of his study, where he'd kept certain documents safe all these years. He'd been too cowardly to come forward back then, just a young intern watching injustice unfold. But now, at 78, he couldn't carry this burden any longer. With slow, deliberate movements, he picked up his phone and dialed the church number listed in the article. The line rang several times before a warm voice answered. "Good evening, New Hope Baptist Church." "Yes, hello. This is Judge Richard Holloway. I need to speak with your pastor regarding Harold Jameson. It's rather urgent." There was a pause on the line. "One moment, Your Honor." While waiting, Richard walked to the filing cabinet, his joints protesting as he knelt down. The bottom drawer stuck slightly. It hadn't been opened in years. Inside, in a manila envelope marked 1,975, lay the evidence he'd protected for decades. Pastor Samuel's voice came on the line. "Judge Holloway? This is quite unexpected." "Pastor, I've been reading about Harold Jameson. I was there. Back in '75, I was an architectural intern on that skyscraper project, and I've been keeping something safe all these years." The pastor's tone sharpened with interest. "What exactly do you have, Judge?" "The original contracts. Harold's signatures. Design approvals with his name clear as day. Even photographs I took of him reviewing blueprints with the construction team." Richard's voice cracked. "I was young, scared to speak up when they pushed him out, but I couldn't let them destroy the evidence. So I took what I could." There was a long silence on the line. Finally, Pastor Samuel spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Judge Holloway, would you be willing to meet with Harold? Tonight?" "Yes," Richard replied without hesitation. "Yes, of course. Where?" An hour later, Richard sat in Pastor Samuel's office, the manila envelope on his lap. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The church was quiet except for distant voices growing closer. The door opened, and Harold Jameson walked in, followed by Pastor Samuel and a young woman Richard would later learn was Maria. Harold looked older than in the newspaper photo, but his eyes held the same dignity Richard remembered from decades ago. "Mr. Jameson," Richard said, struggling to his feet. "You won't remember me, but I was there. I was just a kid, really, watching you work. The way you commanded that construction site. I've never forgotten it." Harold studied him carefully. "The skinny boy with the camera," he said slowly, "always taking pictures of the building progress." Richard nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Yes, sir, that was me. And I've been carrying something for you all these years." With trembling fingers, he opened the manila envelope. Inside were yellowed papers, carefully preserved, contracts with Harold's bold signature, official documents listing him as chief architect and builder, photographs showing him confidently directing crews and reviewing plans. "I was a coward back then," Richard admitted. "When they forced you out, I should have spoken up. But I was young and afraid. All I could think to do was save these. I kept telling myself someday I'd make it right." Harold stared at the documents, his expression unreadable. Pastor Samuel and Maria moved closer, looking over his shoulder at the proof of his legacy. "May I?" Harold asked quietly, reaching for the papers. Richard nodded and carefully placed the documents in Harold's trembling hands. "They're yours, Mr. Jameson. They always were." Harold's hands trembled as he smoothed the stack of yellowed papers on the polished conference table. The law office of Martinez Associates gleamed with morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The view of Chicago's skyline stretched before them, his building standing proud among its steel and glass neighbors. Maria sat beside him, her laptop open and ready. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she organized digital copies of every document they'd gathered. She paused occasionally to squeeze Harold's shoulder, sensing his nervous energy. "We've got this, Mr. Jameson," she said softly. "Everything's here, all the proof we need." Attorney Sophia Martinez spread the contracts across the table like playing cards. Her dark eyes scanned each page methodically, post-it notes marking key passages. "These original contracts are golden, Mr. Jameson. Judge Holloway's testimony adds tremendous weight to your case." Harold nodded, running his weathered finger along his signature from 1973. The ink had faded, but remained clear enough. Harold Jameson, chief architect and builder. He remembered the pride he'd felt that day before everything went wrong. "The construction crew's testimonies align perfectly with these documents," Sophia continued, gesturing to a thick folder. 7 different workers confirming your role as lead designer and builder. Plus, these progress photos clearly show you reviewing blueprints, directing work on site. Maria pulled up the old newspaper clippings they'd discovered. "Look at this one, Mr. Jameson. You're right there in the background, checking the foundation work. The article doesn't name you, but that's definitely you." Harold adjusted his glasses, studying the grainy black and white image. He remembered that day. The concrete pour had to be perfect, and he'd stayed late ensuring every detail was right. "Yes, that's me all right. I wore that same hard hat for 10 years. Sophia's junior partner, James Chen, entered with a fresh pot of coffee. He'd been preparing their media strategy for hours. "The press conference is set for 2 p.m. today." We've got confirmation from all major networks and newspapers. Even that reporter who wrote the Forgotten Builder article will be there." Harold's stomach tightened. What if Keller's lawyers try something else? They've already forged documents once. Sophia's expression hardened. That's exactly why we've had document experts authenticate everything. Judge Holloway's contracts are originals. They show clear aging, proper paper stock for the era, and ink consistent with 1973. The forgeries Keller's team produced won't stand up to scrutiny. Maria pulled up a spreadsheet. I've cross-referenced every date, every signature, every permit number. Everything matches the city's historical records. There's no way they can dispute this. Harold closed his eyes, remembering the weight of silence all these years. The shame of watching others take credit for his work, of being forced to clean the very building he'd created. But now, finally, the truth would come out. James laid out their presentation materials, enlarged photos, contract copies, and testimonial transcripts. We'll start with Judge Holloway's statement, then present the contracts. The construction crew testimonies will follow, backed by the photographic evidence. Finally, we'll reveal the original dedication plaque Maria found. The plaque sat in the center of the table, its brass surface now gleaming after Maria had carefully cleaned it. Harold's name caught the sunlight, no longer hidden in basement shadows. Sophia reviewed their talking points. Remember, Mr. James, stick to the facts. Let the evidence speak for itself. When reporters ask about discrimination, let us handle those questions. Your dignity is your greatest weapon. Harold nodded, straightening his new tie, a gift from his grandchildren. I've been quiet too long. These papers, these photos, they tell the truth I've carried all these years. Maria's phone buzzed with messages from supporters. The prayer vigil is still going strong outside the building. Pastor Samuel says the whole congregation is coming to the press conference. Tears welled in Harold's eyes. After decades of silence, his voice would finally be heard. The building he'd poured his heart into would know its true creator. Your design innovations were years ahead of their time, James noted, reviewing the original blueprints. The energy efficiency features, the structural reinforcements, other buildings didn't adopt these until the 1990s. Harold smiled faintly. I always believed a building should serve its people, not just impress them. Every detail mattered. Sophia gathered their materials into precise piles. We go live in 3 hours. Mr. Jameson, why don't you take a moment to collect your thoughts? Maria can help you review your statement. As the lawyers stepped out, Harold carefully folded the original contracts, handling them like precious relics. His fingers traced the edges where his younger self had signed his name with such hope. Maria watched him with gentle eyes. How are you feeling? Harold took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. You know, child, all these years I thought they'd erased me. But these papers, they kept the truth safe, just waiting for the right time. He patted the contracts with quiet certainty, his voice growing stronger. This time, they can't erase me. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel buzzed with anticipation. Television cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like mechanical fireflies. Reporters filled every seat, notebooks open and pens poised. The ornate ceiling, with its intricate French paintings and golden trim, stretched high above the crowd. Harold Jameson stood behind the curtain, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. His new suit felt stiff, but Maria had insisted on getting it tailored properly for this moment. His weathered hands, calloused from decades of work, couldn't seem to stay still. You ready, Mr. Jameson? Maria asked softly, straightening his pocket square. Her own professional outfit made her look older than her 20 years, though her eyes still sparkled with youth and determination. Ready as I'll ever be, child, Harold replied, his voice rough with emotion. He patted the leather briefcase containing the documents, his proof, his vindication, his truth. Judge Richard Holloway approached them, his silver hair catching the light. Remember, Harold, just tell your story. The documents will speak for themselves. The hotel's event coordinator gave them a signal, and the heavy curtain parted. Harold's heart thundered in his chest as he walked to the podium, flanked by Maria and the judge. Camera flashes erupted like lightning, and the murmur of voices grew louder. "Good morning," Harold began, his deep voice carrying across the room despite his nervousness. "I'm Harold Jameson. For 30 years, I've worked as a janitor in the Midwest Commerce Tower. But before that, I was its chief architect and builder." A rustle of whispers swept through the crowd. Harold opened the briefcase with deliberate care, removing the contracts Judge Holloway had preserved. His fingers traced his own signature, still bold after all these years. "These are the original design contracts." Judge Holloway stepped forward, his judicial authority lending weight to every word. "I was a young intern in 1974 when these were signed. I witnessed Mr. Jameson create the innovative designs that made this building possible." Maria began projecting photographs onto the screen behind them, yellowed images showing a younger Harold reviewing blueprints, directing construction crews, pointing to steel beams being raised into place. Each image drew gasps from the audience. "The unique suspension system that allows the building to sway safely in high winds?" Harold continued, gaining confidence. "That was my design. The revolutionary foundation that adapted to Chicago's soft soil? My solution." His voice grew stronger with each word, decades of suppressed pride finally breaking free. A reporter stood up. "Mr. Jameson, why didn't you come forward sooner?" Harold's expression turned solemn. "In 1974, a black man claiming credit for a masterpiece of architecture." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "I was told to stay quiet or lose everything. I had a family to feed, so I took the only job they'd let me have, janitor in the building I created." Judge Holloway produced more documents, payment records, meeting minutes, original sketches with Harold's distinctive handwriting. "These records show systematic erasure of Mr. Jameson's contributions," he explained, "a deliberate effort to steal his legacy." The room erupted with questions. Reporters stood, shouting and waving their hands. But it was Maria who commanded their attention next, her voice clear and passionate. "Look at these blueprints," she said, displaying detailed technical drawings. "Compare Mr. Jameson's original designs to the final building. They're identical. Every innovative element, every architectural breakthrough. They came from his mind, his talent." More evidence followed. Testimonies from surviving construction workers, photographs of Harold consulting with engineering teams, even a newspaper clipping from 1974 that briefly mentioned H. Jameson as the project's lead architect before the company had it retracted. The energy in the room shifted. Harold could feel it. Decades of lies crumbling under the weight of truth. Reporters who had arrived skeptical were now nodding, scribbling frantically in their notebooks. Photographers crowded closer, capturing every document displayed. "I'm not here seeking revenge," Harold said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm here because truth matters. Because young people like Maria deserve to know that talent and dedication should matter more than the color of your skin." A veteran reporter from the Chicago Tribune stood up. "Mr. Jameson, what would you say to CEO Brad Keller, who claimed you were just a janitor?" Harold smiled, the kind of smile that carried both forgiveness and triumph. "I would say that honest work, whether designing buildings or keeping them clean, deserves respect, and I would say that truth, like cream, always rises to the top." The room broke into spontaneous applause. Reporters rushed forward, thrusting microphones toward Harold. Camera flashes intensified. But through it all, Harold stood tall, his dignity intact, his shoulders straight. Maria squeezed his hand as the first tweets began appearing on the projected screen behind them. "Justice for Harold" started trending. News alerts pinged on phones throughout the room. The story was spreading like wildfire. Within hours, major networks picked up the story. "Janitor was the true builder all along," flashed across screens nationwide. Harold's photo, both young and present day, appeared side by side, his journey from architect to janitor to vindicated creator capturing America's imagination. The truth, hidden for so long in basement walls and forgotten files, was finally free. Harold stood at the podium, tears glistening in his eyes, as decades of silence turned to triumph. His building stretched toward the sky outside the hotel windows, no longer just a place he cleaned, but a testament to his genius, his perseverance, and his unbreakable spirit. Brad Keller stood before the wall of windows in his corner office, his reflection ghostly against the Chicago skyline. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Emails flooded his inbox. Voice messages piled up. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he knew it. "Sir?" His assistant's voice trembled through the intercom. "The board is waiting in the conference room." Keller straightened his silk tie, a gesture that had always given him confidence. But today, his hands shook. He grabbed his leather briefcase, Italian, worth more than a month of Harold's salary, and walked down the hallway that had once been his kingdom. Inside the conference room, stern faces greeted him. Board members he'd schmoozed with over golf now sat rigid, their expressions cold. Papers scattered across the polished mahogany table. Copies of Harold's original contracts, photographs, testimonies from retired workers. "Mr. Keller," the board chairman spoke, his voice heavy. "We've reviewed the evidence, the forgery of documents, the attempt to discredit Mr. Jameson, the years of covering up the truth. It's unconscionable." Keller tried to maintain his usual arrogant smile, but it faltered. "Now, let's not be hasty. This is clearly a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" A senior board member cut in, her voice sharp. "The entire city knows you tried to bury the truth about who built this building. Our phones are ringing off the hook with investors threatening to pull out." Through the glass walls, Keller could see office workers gathering, watching the scene unfold. Some held their phones up, recording. His humiliation was becoming a spectacle, just like he'd tried to make Harold's life a spectacle. "We're requesting your immediate resignation," the chairman continued. "Security will escort you to clear out your office." Keller's face flushed red. "You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am? Who my family is?" "We know exactly who you are, Mr. Keller." Another board member spoke up. "That's the problem." Outside the building, a crowd had gathered. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Protesters held signs reading, "Justice for Harold" and "Truth Prevails." Security guards flanked Keller as he emerged from the revolving doors, carrying a box of personal items. Camera flashes exploded around him. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Keller, did you knowingly suppress the truth about Harold Jameson? How long have you been covering up the building's real history? What do you say to accusations of racial discrimination?" The crowd's boos grew louder. Someone threw a paper cup that splashed coffee on Keller's expensive suit. He tried to shield his face with the box, but the cameras caught everything. His red face, his stumbling steps, the stains spreading across his jacket. Up in the building, Harold stood at a window, watching the scene below. Maria stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Look at him now," she said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Not so powerful anymore, is he?" But Harold didn't smile. He remembered his grandmother's words from long ago. "Don't dance when your enemy falls, child. Just thank the Lord for justice, and keep your heart clean." "I don't feel happy about it," Harold said softly, watching Keller duck into a waiting car. "Just relieved. Like a heavy weight's been lifted." The car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into Chicago traffic. Camera crews began packing up their equipment. The crowd slowly dispersed, their signs lowered, their voices quieting. Harold turned away from the window and looked around the lobby. The marble floors he'd polished countless times, the brass fixtures he'd kept gleaming, the soaring ceiling he'd designed all those years ago. Each surface held memories of both pain and pride. "You know what my daddy used to say?" Harold spoke, his voice thoughtful. "He'd say, 'Son, cream always rises to the top. Might take a while, but truth got a way of floating up.'" Maria squeezed his shoulder. "Your daddy was right." A janitor pushed his cart past them, the wheels squeaking slightly on the polished floor. Harold watched him work, remembering all the years he'd done the same. There was dignity in all work. He knew that now more than ever. "What matters isn't seeing him fall," Harold said, straightening his shoulders. "What matters is the truth, finally standing tall." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the lobby. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm, cars honking, people rushing, life moving forward. But inside, in this moment, Harold felt a deep sense of peace. He reached into his pocket and touched the old plaque, its surface worn smooth from his fingers. He didn't need it anymore. The truth was out there now, written in newspapers, broadcast on television, etched in the memories of all who had witnessed justice finally prevail. "You want to get some coffee?" Maria asked, giving his shoulder a final pat. Harold nodded, taking one last look at the lobby. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think I'd like that." They walked toward the elevator, their footsteps echoing in the space Harold had created decades ago. He didn't look back at the window, didn't need to see any more of Keller's departure. The weight of old wounds had lifted, replaced by something lighter, not joy at another's downfall, but gratitude for the simple triumph of truth. The elevator doors closed with a soft ding, carrying them down to the street level. Harold hummed a few bars of Amazing Grace, the same hymn he'd hummed while mopping these floors for years. But now the words held new meaning, speaking of wounds healed and chains broken. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the city in shades of gold. Harold paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the building that had been both his creation and his cross to bear. Now it was just a building again, beautiful, strong, and finally honest about its origins. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered so softly only he could hear. "Thank you for justice in your own time." The autumn sun painted golden streaks across the Chicago skyline as crowds gathered in front of the towering glass and steel building. The plaza buzzed with excitement, filled with hundreds of people holding signs that read, "Justice for Harold" and "The True Builder Returns." News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes stretching toward the sky like metal flowers. Harold Jamison stood behind the makeshift stage, his hands smoothing down the lapels of his new charcoal suit. The fabric felt foreign against his skin after decades of wearing a janitor's uniform. Maria stood beside him, beaming with pride as she adjusted his blue silk tie. "You ready, Mr. Jamison?" she asked, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. Harold's voice trembled. "I've been ready for 40 years, child." In the front row, his 3 grandchildren, Michael, Tasha, and little James, sat straight-backed in their Sunday best. Their mother, Harold's daughter Sarah, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Behind them, dozens of retired construction workers who had worked under Harold's leadership decades ago filled several rows, their weathered faces glowing with vindication. The mayor stepped up to the podium, his voice booming across the plaza. "Today, we right a historical wrong. Today, we honor a man whose vision and talent helped shape our great city's skyline, only to have his achievement buried by prejudice and greed." Harold's chest tightened as he listened. Pastor Samuel, standing nearby, placed a steadying hand on his back. The morning air felt crisp and clean, carrying the sound of traffic and distant train whistles, the heartbeat of the city he'd helped build. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor continued, "it is my profound honor to present Mr. Harold Jamison, the true architect and builder of the Lakefront Tower." The crowd erupted in applause as Harold walked onto the stage. His steps were measured and dignified, just as they had been when he'd supervised construction on this very spot so many years ago. As he reached the podium, he caught sight of his reflection in the building's glass facade, no longer the humble janitor, but the proud builder he'd always been. "Thank you," Harold began, his deep voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "For 40 years I walked these halls with a mop in my hands, cleaning floors I had once designed. I watched others take credit for my work, but they could never take away my knowledge of every beam, every joint, every calculation that went into making this building stand tall." In the front row, little James, only 7 years old, wiped tears from his cheeks with his sleeve. Tasha, 12, held her younger brother's hand while trying to maintain her composure. Michael, the oldest at 15, sat straight and proud, his chin lifted high. "I didn't fight back then," Harold continued, his voice growing stronger. "I had a family to feed, and times were different. But I never forgot. Every morning when I came to work, I would touch the cornerstone and whisper, 'I built you.' Every evening when I left, I would look up at the lights shining from these windows and think, 'I made you shine.'" The retired construction workers nodded, some wiping their eyes. They remembered the young Harold, confident and skilled, leading them through the massive project with precision and care. To my grandchildren, Harold turned to face them, his voice thick with emotion. I want you to know that your grandfather wasn't just a janitor. I was a builder, an architect, a dreamer who reached for the sky. Don't ever let anyone tell you what you can't achieve. Don't ever let them make you feel small. Tasha sobbed openly now, clutching her brother's hands. Sarah wrapped her arms around her children, her shoulders shaking with pride and joy. The mayor returned to the podium, directing everyone's attention to a veiled plaque mounted on the building's exterior wall. It is time to restore truth to our city's history. Mr. Jameson, would you do us the honor? Harold walked to the wall, his steps steady despite his pounding heart. Maria joined him, taking one side of the rope while he took the other. The bronze plaque gleamed beneath the cloth, waiting to be revealed. Pull it now, Grandpa, little James called out, his voice carrying across the quiet plaza. With a deep breath, Harold tugged the rope. The cloth fell away, revealing the shining bronze plaque that read, Lakefront Tower, designed and built by Harold Jameson, Chief Architect and Builder, 1975, 1978. To God be the glory, Harold whispered, touching the letters of his name. They were solid and real under his fingertips, permanent, like the truth they represented. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The construction veterans stood, offering a standing ovation to their long-ago leader. Cameras flashed as Harold's grandchildren rushed the stage, wrapping their arms around his waist. Is this really you, Grandpa? James asked, pointing at the plaque. Did you really build this whole big building? Harold lifted his youngest grandson into his arms, despite his age, and touched the boy's hand to the bronze letters. Yes, son, your grandfather built this, and now everyone knows it. The morning sun climbed higher, making the bronze plaque shine like a beacon of truth finally revealed. Harold stood there, surrounded by his family, his legacy no longer hidden in shadow, but restored to its rightful place in the light. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps of City Hall as crowds began to disperse from the ceremony. Harold stood near the newly unveiled bronze plaque, his hand resting gently on its smooth surface, still processing the magnitude of the moment. His grandchildren had gone to get the car, leaving him a quiet moment to reflect. Maria approached him, clutching an official-looking envelope to her chest. Her eyes were bright with excitement, though she was trying hard to contain it out of respect for Harold's emotional moment. Mr. Jameson, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, I have something to tell you. Harold turned from the plaque, his weathered face still bearing traces of tears from the ceremony. What is it, child? Maria's hands shook as she opened the envelope. The city's architectural board. They've awarded me a full scholarship to study architecture at Illinois Institute of Technology. Her voice cracked with emotion. They said your story inspired them to create a special diversity initiative for aspiring architects from underrepresented backgrounds. Harold's eyes widened, and a fresh wave of tears threatened to spill over. Lord have mercy, he whispered. I wouldn't have even applied if it wasn't for you, Maria continued, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Watching you fight for your truth, seeing how you designed this building. She gestured to the towering skyscraper behind them. It made me believe I could do it too. Harold reached out and took her hands in his grip firm despite his age. When I was your age, they told me I couldn't design buildings because of the color of my skin. They said janitor work was all I'd ever be good for. He shook his head slowly. But I kept drawing, kept learning, kept believing. Maria squeezed his hands. You never stopped building, even when they tried to erase you. That's right, Harold nodded, his voice growing stronger. And now look at what God has done. Not only has He restored my name, but He's using my story to open doors for others. He looked directly into Maria's eyes. Keep building what they say you can't. Whatever obstacles come your way, whatever doubts they try to plant in your mind, you keep building. Tears streamed down Maria's face now. I wouldn't be here without you, Mr. Jameson. You're the reason I believed this was possible. No, child, Harold said gently. You believed in me when nobody else would. You fought for my truth when I was ready to give up. This scholarship? You earned every bit of it with your heart and your courage." Maria threw her arms around Harold, hugging him tightly. Harold held her close, like a grandfather embracing his granddaughter. They stood there on the steps of City Hall, both crying freely now, their tears mixing joy and gratitude, pain and triumph. "My mama always said God works in mysterious ways," Harold murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "He used a young intern to help an old janitor reclaim his legacy. And now that same intern is going to design buildings of her own." Maria pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes. "I promise I'll make you proud, Mr. Jameson. I'll design buildings that tell stories, that stand for justice and truth, just like you did." Harold patted her shoulder, his eyes glistening. "You already make me proud, child. You already make me proud." They held each other, two souls connected by more than just a building or a battle for justice. They were bound by the unshakable truth that dreams, no matter how long deferred, could still bloom into reality. Their tears weren't just for the moment. They were for every person who had ever been told they couldn't, for every dream that had been dismissed, for every truth that had been buried but refused to stay hidden. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting a warm glow over the bronze plaque that now bore Harold's name. In that embrace, both Harold and Maria knew that this wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning, a torch being passed from one generation to another, from one dreamer to the next. The morning sun streamed through the towering glass windows of the skyscraper's lobby, casting prismatic patterns across the polished marble floors. Harold Jameson stood tall in his new charcoal suit, surrounded by his 3 grandchildren, Marcus, 14, Lily, 12, and little James, 8. Their eyes were wide with wonder as they gazed up at the soaring ceiling. "You see those curved beams up there?" Harold pointed with a steady hand. "Most builders back then wanted straight lines everywhere, but I knew curves would make the space feel more welcoming, like you're being embraced when you walk in." Lily squeezed her grandfather's hand. "Did you really design all of this, Grandpa?" "Sure did, sweetheart." Harold's voice was warm with pride. "Come here, let me show you something special." He led them to a corner of the lobby where the morning light hit the wall at just the right angle. The children gathered close as Harold ran his fingers along the intricate pattern carved into the marble. "These designs here, they're based on your great-grandmother's quilting patterns. She used to make the most beautiful quilts you've ever seen. I wanted to honor her creativity in my own way." Marcus traced the pattern with his finger, his expression thoughtful. "That's amazing, Grandpa. It's like you put your whole heart into this building." "That's exactly right, son." Harold guided them to the elevator. "Now, let me show you something even more special." As they ascended, Harold explained how he'd designed the elevator system to be both efficient and smooth. "Feel how gentle it moves? That was my doing. Didn't want folks getting jumpy stomachs on their way to work." The doors opened on the 30th floor, and Harold led his grandchildren down a corridor he knew by heart. "This floor was always my favorite. The views are just right. High enough to see the city spread out before you, but not so high that you lose touch with the street life below." James pressed his face against the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching cars move like tiny toys far below. "Wow, Grandpa, you can see forever from up here," Harold chuckled, placing a gentle hand on James's shoulder. "That's why I made these windows extra tall. Want to know a secret? I designed them specifically so even little kids could see out without having to be picked up." Lily spun around slowly, taking in the space. "But Grandpa, how come you had to be a janitor here for so long? It's not fair." Harold's expression grew serious, but his eyes remained gentle. "Life isn't always fair, sugar. But what matters is staying true to yourself, even when others try to push you down. I kept this building clean all those years because I loved it. It was still my creation, even if nobody else knew it then." They continued their tour, with Harold pointing out countless details that only the building's creator would know. He showed them the hidden support columns disguised as decorative elements, explained how he designed the ventilation system to be whisper quiet, and revealed the subtle ways he'd incorporated natural light throughout the structure. See how the sunlight moves through the building? He gestured to the way shadows and light played across the walls. I planned it all out using models I built myself. Wanted everyone who worked here to feel connected to the outside world, even when they're inside. Marcus, who had been taking pictures with his phone, suddenly lowered it and looked at his grandfather with new understanding. You didn't just build a building, did you, Grandpa? You built something that makes people's lives better. Harold's eyes misted over. That's exactly right, son. A building isn't just steel and concrete, it's about the people who use it. Every decision I made was thinking about them. They took the stairs down one floor, Harold showing them how he'd designed the stairwell to be inviting rather than just functional. Most buildings treat stairs like an afterthought, but I wanted them to be pleasant in case the elevators ever stopped working. See these windows here? And the wider steps? Makes it feel less like a emergency exit and more like part of the building's heart. As they walked, Lily noticed something. Grandpa, some of these designs look like the ones in our church. Harold beamed. You've got a good eye, baby girl. I did take some inspiration from our church, wanted to bring a little bit of that peace and dignity into the workplace. They eventually made their way to a special corner office on the 28th floor. This, Harold said, opening the door, was my favorite space to design. The acoustics in here are perfect. You can hear yourself think, but you're not cut off from the world outside. The children walked around the room in awe, touching the wood paneling, feeling the texture of the walls, and gazing out the carefully positioned windows. Your great-grandfather was a carpenter, Harold explained, running his hand along the desk built into the wall. He taught me that craftsmanship isn't just about making things look good. It's about making them last. Everything in this building was built to stand the test of time. James looked up at his grandfather with shining eyes. Just like you did, Grandpa? You lasted a long time too, waiting for people to know the truth. Harold knelt down to his youngest grandchild's level, his voice thick with emotion. That's right, James. Sometimes the truth takes a while to come out, but it always does in the end. They made their way back to the lobby, where Harold gathered his grandchildren close. The morning sun had shifted, casting new patterns across the floor he'd designed so many years ago. His heart was full, watching his grandchildren see the building, really see it, for the first time. Standing there, surrounded by the fruits of his labor and the legacy of his determination, Harold pulled his grandchildren close. His voice was soft but firm as he whispered to them, "This is ours now." The setting sun painted Chicago's skyline in brilliant oranges and deep purples. The crowd from the ceremony had long since dispersed, leaving Harold Jameson alone in front of the building he had created decades ago. The evening air carried a gentle breeze, rustling the leaves of the young trees lining the plaza. Harold stood before the newly unveiled bronze plaque, his reflection visible in its polished surface. The metal still felt warm from the day's sun as he placed his weathered hand upon it, fingers tracing the raised letters of his name. Harold Jameson, Chief Architect and Builder, 1975. The city was coming alive with evening light. One by one, windows illuminated in the surrounding buildings, creating a symphony of golden squares against the darkening sky. In his own building, yes, his building, lights flickered on floor by floor, each one a testament to the dreams he'd poured into every beam and bolt. His mind drifted back to those early mornings on the construction site, the smell of fresh concrete, the sound of steel beams being hoisted into place. He remembered the pride in his workers' eyes when they'd completed each floor, the way they'd trusted his vision even when others doubted. The security guard inside the lobby, a young man named Tony, gave Harold a respectful nod through the glass doors. How different from the suspicious glances he'd received in the past. Now, people looked at him and saw not just a janitor, but the man who had reached into the sky and built something magnificent. Traffic hummed on the street behind him. A taxi honked in the distance. The city was settling into its evening rhythm, the same rhythm he'd observed for countless nights while cleaning these floors, while keeping his secret locked away in his heart. He thought of Maria, heading off to architecture school in the fall. She'd promised to visit, to show him her designs. "You're going to be my mentor," she'd said, her eyes shining with determination, "whether you like it or not." The memory brought a warm smile to his face. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the familiar sounds of the city, his city. He'd built more than just this building. He'd built a legacy. His grandchildren would walk these streets with their heads held high, knowing their grandfather's story. They would know that dignity and truth could never be buried forever. Harold's fingers lingered on the cool bronze, feeling the deep-cut letters that spelled out his name. The same name that had been hidden, denied, pushed into shadows for so many years. But like the gospel hymns he'd hummed while mopping these floors, the truth had risen up, impossible to silence. The first stars were becoming visible in the deepening blue above, twinkling between the towers of steel and glass. Harold thought of Mary, his late wife, who had believed in him through all the hard years. "She knows," he whispered to himself. "She always knew." Looking up at the magnificent structure before him, his structure, his dream, made real, Harold felt a peace settle over him like a warm blanket. The bitterness that had lived in his heart for so long had melted away, replaced by something stronger, gratitude. In the growing darkness, the building's lights seemed to shine even brighter, each window a beacon of hope. Harold stood straighter, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted with quiet dignity. This moment wasn't just about him, it was about every person who'd ever been told they weren't good enough, every dream that had been dismissed, every truth that had been buried. He felt a strange lightness in his chest, as if decades of weight had finally been lifted. The night air felt clean and new in his lungs. Above him, his building stretched toward the heavens, every line and curve exactly as he'd imagined them all those years ago. Looking to the sky, he said softly, "They can take your name off the wall, but they can never erase the work of your hands or the faith in your heart." A gentle smile spread across his face as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. Harold Jamison was finally at peace. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Harold Jamison, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.